This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Hello and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. Now, for the first time in this series, we move stateside to find the answers to the question haunting the USA and the world. Can Donald Trump really make a presidential comeback next year? The legal obstacles are formidable. Trump faces a total of 91 felony counts across 2 state courts and 2 different federal districts. A conviction in any of them could send him to jail, and some for a very long time. He's also answering badly, a civil suit in New York that could bring down substantial parts of his business empire, including a ban on his business operations in his home state. Regardless, he is still by a country mile the leading Republican candidate in the presidential race, though lawsuits in several states seek to have him disqualified from the presidency. If the criminal and civil cases are pursued promptly, he could be in full campaign swing, just as his legal fate is being determined. So is it possible to envisage a Trump comeback under these conditions, or is it all just campaign hot air, the whiff of burnt-out fireworks? Well, we asked 2 opinion leaders from totally different standpoints in the debate. To one, it would be a dream, to the other, a nightmare. Firstly, that pillar of the American liberal establishment, the Canadian anthropologist Wade Davis, imagines for him the truly appalling prospect of a second Trump term. Secondly, we turn to the other side of the floor to ask the president, this time of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles. Ed Martin was the co-author of the Conservative Case for Trump, which was influential in the first presidential run. Is he still of the same mind? We shall find out later. But first, to America's favourite anthropologist, the Canadian professor Wade Davis.
I'm now delighted to be joined by the celebrated anthropologist, Professor Wade Davis. Wade, welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Hi, Alex. Nice to see you again.
Dave, I mean, this is an extraordinary, unprecedented position. We have a president of the United States, past president, about to stand again, facing 90 plus criminal charges across 2 states, 2 federal districts, plus a civil suit against his business organisation, which by all accounts is going very badly for him. And yet he's leading by a mile in the Republican polls, and he's even edging out the sitting president in the national polls. How can this possibly be?
Well, you know, we've almost entered the realm of the phantasmagoric or the surreal, and almost difficult to believe as it may be, it is in fact happening. And the one thing we have to always remember is that at every point that we thought that Trump had done something that would, by any standard convention, eliminate him from contention, he's managed to overcome that with the kind of barrage of rhetoric and falsehoods and appealing to the base instincts of the American people, I'd say. Whether he'll be able to weather the convictions, whether the convictions will hold, or whether his core base will simply conclude that this was a conspiracy all along that he's been describing it to be, is a really critical question. Because, you know, if there's one thing we've learned to expect from Trump, is that he does realize his promises. And the kinds of things he's been saying about politicizing the Justice Department, about overtly seeking revenge on those who he felt betrayed him in the 2020 election, the whole litany of petty complaints and and vendettas that he's put out. I don't think we should think of this as just loose talk. I think this is something that he, in his kind of delusions, will actually and actively pursue. And a lot will depend on the power of the judiciary. A lot will depend on the integrity of the Congress, which is a questionable thing these days, or even the integrity of the Supreme Court, which has been clearly politicized in a way that it hasn't been since the time of FDR. So these are very, very perilous times. And again, Alex, when we think of the last time we spoke, and when we first got in touch in the wake of that piece I wrote in Rolling Stone in 2020, those were, in comparison, despite the threat of the pandemic at the time, mild times compared to what we're facing now. Can you imagine what would be going on in Ukraine were Trump to be president, with his close relationship, his adulation of Vladimir Putin? You know, what would be going on in the Middle East in this incredibly difficult challenge between the agony of the Israeli people, the egregious, the murderous, the horrific acts of Hamas, and then the reality of the millions of Palestinians who are suffering under the Israeli assault, an assault that nobody could have stopped, you know. And so these are very challenging times. And to have us elect and re-elect, reaffirm the values, the character, the activities, the cynical, self-serving elements of this character, Trump, would send such a signal to the world about the strength and integrity of the American dream. I mean, I think it would be historically just catastrophic.
Well, let's just take you into that nightmare scenario for a second or two. Given the objectives, given the rhetoric of President Trump, given his thirst for revenge on those who've wronged him, as he would see it, has the American system got the strength and checks and balances to restrain an incoming president who is out of control in terms of what would normally be regarded as proper behavior?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, Alex? I mean, we really are entering new territory. You know, civilization is a kind of thin veneer over the barbaric heart that history sadly teaches us lies within all human beings. You know, why is it that these instincts continue to sort of express themselves in violence and war? It just seems to be the condition of humanity. And we take for granted something like the stability of the democratic system, even the fundamental liberal idea going back to the Enlightenment, which brought so many benefits to humanity. And these things are by no means carved in stone. I mean, they can be challenged. Things can turn over in a heartbeat, as we've seen through every era of history. And this is really going to be a challenge at a time of enormous international instability.
Now, you mentioned a few seconds ago an article in the Rolling Stone magazine you wrote in 2020, a very celebrated and famous article, had a big impact. And that was you postulated through the COVID pandemic that was spreading at the time that this symbolized the end of the American era. Now, is that still your opinion? Have you revised your opinion, or have subsequent events strengthened that train of thought?
Well, basically, Alex, that article, which is actually coming out in a new collection of essays of mine in the spring called Beneath the Surface of Things, was written in the heat of the moment in July of 2020, at the kind of the lowest point of the lockdown and the lowest point of America's fortunes in terms of dealing with the COVID-19 epidemic or the pandemic. And like anything written in the heat of the moment, it got some things right and some things wrong. With the election, or the possible election of Trump looming in the fall of that year, and America's response to the epidemic at the time being arguably the weakest of the major nations of the world. And at the same time, that summer, the plight of Canada looked extraordinarily good. Well, Canada didn't escape the pandemic, although we did much better than our neighbors at the south. And who could have guessed at that time that these novel RNA-based vaccines, which had never been imagined before, would be produced within months, as if to affirm, in fact, the very notion of exceptionalism, of American exceptionalism, that essay called into question. And that essay was in no way an indictment. It was more like an intervention. It was like holding you when someone is needs an intervention, you have to hold the mirror to their face to remind them how far they have fallen. And the basic thrust of that article, looking at COVID not as a health issue or an issue of medical care, but through the lens of culture and history, I think really does stand. And what the article was really saying is that what had made America so strong as it came out of the victory in the Second World War had gradually been eroded over the last 40 years through any number of identifiable forces, to the extent that America had almost lost its sense of collective good, collective well-being, its sense of itself as a society. And what we were seeing at that time was that the social democracies with stronger social contracts, with citizens who had stronger faith in government to address a national, international issue like the pandemic, these countries are certainly coming out on top. I think the basic idea I had is that it's important to America to look in the mirror and see what has become of itself is probably more important today than ever before. I mean, if we step back, we are America, and again, I should say too, Alex, that I always thought of that intervention, that article, in a way, not as an anti-American diatribe. I'd like to think that it reached a global audience because it was free of ideology, free of polemics, and written with great empathy for a nation that had made my life possible. Senator Cory Booker says that, if America hasn't broken your heart, then you don't love her enough. And that's my feeling about the United States. But right now is now, and America is facing an enormous challenge. Will this man, if not legally, politically, socially, escape 91 criminal indictments? Will this man, who single-handedly, with his cadre of dark associates, attempted to overthrow an American presidential election? These aren't trivial things. A man who is on record as threatening to expel millions of legal immigrants and illegal immigrants, a man who is on record as saying that he will politicize for his own personal gain, a dictatorial gain, the judiciary, which has been the independent arm of American justice since the dawn of the nation. So the big question becomes, is the best of America, the better angels of its nature, as Lincoln said, is it up to the task of taking this on? I've got, for example, Trump, has made noises about, as many Republicans have, of withdrawing all support to Ukraine. Well, think of what that message would send to any potential ally. We've already, had a dubious record in interventions from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq and many other places. If we suddenly, having set up Ukraine to combat our historic antagonist, Russia, former Soviet Union, and then we abandoned them. I mean, I've got a son-in-law in the military who says that supporting Ukraine is the best possible thing we could do for a modest amount of funding in the scheme of things. We are humiliating our historic antagonist without a drop of American blood being shed. I mean, but if Trump comes in and just pulls back on that, if he does any of the number of the things that he's proclaimed are his plans, including vengeance. What American presidential candidate has run on the basis of seeking personal revenge?
Now, before President Trump can challenge American democracy again, he has to overrun the Republican Party, which he's done before. Now, do you see anything in the other group of candidates for the Republican nomination that has the slightest chance of being an obstacle to to the Trump tanks running over the grand old party?
I mean, I think the real question is what will happen with these criminal indictments, and will they actually come to verdicts before the primary campaign is over? You know, you have to ask yourself: is there no breaking point for ordinary Americans who have supported Trump, but may in fact have a line in the sand they won't cross? You know, are we really prepared to have a sitting president incarcerated, which is, I think, at least theoretically possible? As for the congressional leadership, there is none. What we're seeing in the Republican Party is a whole generation of individuals who have no interest whatsoever in actually working for the good of the country. I mean, they can't even put a single piece of legislation forward. I mean, most of the individuals who were in the race to be Speaker of the House, for example, had notoriously thin records on actually bringing into being any legislation. I mean, you know, my father-in-law was a Republican senator, and he prided himself on working across the aisle to do good with the Democratic colleagues that he revered, if he didn't agree necessarily with all their political positions. But the Congress is flaccid, and will walk a foot, you know, in tow with Trump simply because they're terrified of losing access to his base, or to be individually singled out and demonized by him, as he's been willing to do with anybody who has crossed him. You know, as for the Democrats, they've got their own challenges from their extreme progressive left that don't do them any good with their tenacious hold on you know the woke orthodoxy that is not something that most Americans accept or concur with. You know, so it's a tricky one, and you know there's so many contradictions. I mean, if we actually look at Biden's record on the economy, for example, even on energy, on climate, it's pretty damn good. If you look at the international crises that he's had to maneuver, Ukraine and now Gaza, he's doing pretty well for someone in an almost impossible situation. Physically, he's orders of magnitude fitter than Donald Trump. And why is it this issue of his age clings to him and slips off Trump, who, if you only see him outside of that business suit on a golf course, you see how grotesquely obese, out of shape, and dangerously unhealthy the man is. You know, he favors those long red ties in the business suit simply because it hides his belly. And here he is making fun of DeSantis or even Haley for their quote unquote heels, when he's notorious for having worn the same kind of elevated shoes to accentuate his height. So, you know, I don't know, Alex. It's you know, Oscar Wilde said there's no such thing as parody in America because this already happened. And we're living through one of those times where you can almost, you know, you wake up and you can't believe what's unfolding, but there it is right before you.
Well, Jack Nicklaus told me once that Donald Trump cheats at golf as well, so that would be no great surprise to anyone. Is the last best hope then to forestall Trump? Is he in more danger from the prison cell, or is he in more danger of being defeated again by incumbent President Biden?
Well, I think it would be a very sweet closure to this saga to have Trump, if he is nominated, be defeated, and ideally decisively defeated by Biden. I think that would surely the self-interest of the Republican politicians and the party itself would recognize that, having led them to defeat in so many battles, if you will, it's time for the man to get off the stage. You know, maybe, you know, we've been hoping for so long that in the same way that it took a single phrase to break the back of McCarthyism, you know, sir, have you no shame? Is there not a line, is not a moment where something's going to come along to finally expose the grifter that Trump demonstrably is, the bone spur warrior that he is. You know, I find Bobby Kennedy's campaign interesting because, well, first of all, Bobby's a very good friend of mine. But I think Bobby is actually, whatever you feel about his position, for example, on vaccines, which is kind of a distraction from the core commitments that he's expressing in his campaign. This is a kind of a popularism that is positive. You know, he is addressing the concerns of the ordinary American. I mean, one of the things that Rolling Stone piece pointed out is that the social contract that came out of World War II and the extraordinary economic well-being of the United States in the wake of that war allowed for a social contract that built the middle class, gave us the weekend, and allowed working men and women in America to have a home, send their kids to good schools, even have maybe certainly a car, if not a summer cottage even. And that contract, of course, was broken through globalization, through you know, any number of developments in the last 20, 30 years. And people have suffered. I mean, you know, for Americans under 50, for example, it's no longer car accidents that the highest cause of mortality and morbidity, it's drug overdoses. And so the sweep of addiction through the overuse of opiates, for example, you know, the working class of America has been really suffering, which accounts for their rage, if you will, and accounts for, I think, their sort of almost atavistic support of Trump, because he simply stands up to people that they feel have been looking down at them for a very long time, what they see to be the media elites, the elites of Hollywood, the elites of the West and the East Coast.
So Wade Davis, as this drama unfolds over the next year, we'll certainly be back to see what the next dramatic, unbelievable chapter is in the possible return of Donald J. Trump. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Always great to be with you, Alex. Thanks very much.
In our last show, we featured two of the finest commentators around, Steve Richards and Peter Oborne. This is what they had to say about the impact of the carnage in Gaza on UK politics, and an extract from Peter Oborne's moving report from Nablus in the occupied West Bank.
But then, of course, we had the Israel-Gaza tragedy still being played out, which I think again raised some questions for Labour. It was during Keir Starmer's party conference set of interviews that he told LBC, apparently, although he denies it, that he supported Israel's right to block energy and food into Gaza. Now, in a way, I think that's been the cause of all his problems. So even when a leader senses he is being triumphant, he can get into some difficulty. So that was Starmer's problem, and that's still being played out. But for Sunak, there are stages now, I think, of desperation. You wake up and think, well, that didn't work. I claimed to be the agent of change at the party conference. Well, now I'll try and bring back David Cameron and see if that works. And I think the opinion polls, you know what it's like being a leader of a party and first minister. You do follow them. You can't help but follow them. And when they're bad, really do have an impact on your kind of sense of desperation.
Well, they were always sky high when I was First Minister, Steve. That was so, but I never had that total adversity that's overcoming the Prime Minister.
Well, just speaking as a British citizen, forget about politics. Looking at it from here, and I think for many, many people in Britain, what you have is two very odd things. One is a huge outrage whipped up by the right-wing press, whipped up by the Prime Minister, whipped up by the former Home Secretary against the marchers marching across Britain for peace and in solidarity with the Palestinians whose suffering is incredible. At the same time, not a word of sympathy, not a word of outrage, not a word of criticism from the British Prime Minister and his government against the Israeli government for the mass slaughter of what is well over 10,000 Palestinians now in Gaza, including probably 5,000 children. We've seen this on our TV screens all the time. And that is not something they will criticize Israel for at all, while going after the protesters. There's something deeply sick about this. Forget about the politics. It's just morally wrong. It's a betrayal of this thing they go on all the time about, which is British values. This is not British values to worry about somebody going on a march and accuse them as hate marchers and to just give a free pass to a government which is slaughtering people in their thousands and in uncountable numbers now.
And here is what you had to say about the show. Pim says, another great show and a roller coaster of emotions, from the giddy inspiration of Eric Liddell's achievements and moral fortitude, to seeing again Alex welcoming Ash to the party, to the horrors playing out in the Middle East. Peter Oborne's comparison to the clearances struck a nerve. So much to think about. Thanks for sharing. Sky Echo says, excellent. Peter Oborne speaking from the West Bank was particularly enlightening on all salient points relating to Gaza. Valerie says, particularly grateful for the interview with Peter Oborne. He has valuable knowledge of what is happening and his time in the West Bank is much appreciated. Thanks. SN4 says, always lots to think about in these shows. Thank you for this. Kezzy says, Peter Oborne was a great guest. And finally, Mo Vernal says, what a pleasant surprise to see Eric Liddell as the subject of today's Hidden Heroes. He was a man of faith and a great Scot. Keep this marvellous series going. Thank you very much indeed, Mo. Well, Hidden Heroes is back this week, sponsored as always by Flagship Media.
Today's Hidden Hero is a person, but it's also a book. The person is James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd. And the book is the private memoir and confessions of a justified sinner. Just about the scariest novel ever written, but hardly known about outside a few select circles. Now, James Hogg was born a decade after Robert Burns, but born in the borders of Scotland as opposed to in Ayrshire. Very similar in terms of their background. Both fathers were tenant farmers. They were both heavily celebrated in their time because they were heaven taught. In actual terms, James Hogg's claim to be self-taught was much stronger than Robert Burns's, because Burns was an educated man, and although he hadn't been all that long at parish school, nonetheless his father had tutors for Robert Burns, and Burns was well-educated in the classic. James Hogg had a bigger hurdle to overcome. He was very much self-taught. He had a few months at a parish school. The rest of it was his own reading and the books that were given to him. And he was a shepherd, as his father was, and he spent a lot of his time as a shepherd reading books and teaching himself. So his literary output in late 18th century and early 19th century Scotland was formidable. And Edinburgh, of course, was the most literary and the most literate society on earth at that time, with many opportunities to publish your work. The Edinburgh Magazine, Blackwood's Magazine, a host of publications thirsting for original works. And very much he filled that, the Ettrick Shepherd filled that gap. James Hogg went right into that circle. So that's how a shepherd became a friend of William Wordsworth, a confidant of Sir Walter Scott. In fact, he wrote an unofficial biography of Walter Scott. Something a bit fruity in places. I'm not sure Walter Scott would have approved if he'd seen the text, but nonetheless, this is a man from, despite his humble beginnings, because of the mobility, the social mobility in Scottish society of that time, through the literary world at least, he became a very celebrated figure, and his works, his poems, his works about Scotland, his songs were highly regarded. He went out of fashion for most of the 19th century and most of the 20th century, but has come back into fashion more recently as it's been realised that some of his works have been heavily edited by priggish Victorians who didn't like some of the uncouth ideas and uncouth sentiments that he expressed. And it's regarded that certain of his novels, the Free Perils of Man, the Free Perils of Women, are now regarded as significant novels in their own right. But then we come to this book, The Private Memoir and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I mean, this is a book about murder, about fratricide, about Calvinism, and about pure evil. I sometimes think that Stephen King, celebrated horror writer, must have got hold of a copy at some point in the 1960s and 70s and started him on his epic series of frightening novels, because this is the most frightening book that certainly I've ever read. If you haven't read it, and that would be most people watching this, then get a copy and read it. Don't read it alone, don't read it late at night. Don't read it where there's things going to creak in the cupboards and there'll be strange noises. Read it during the daytime in broad daylight. You'll still be scared, but at least you'll have company. For some extraordinary reason, this book has never been filmed. It should be filmed, of course. There's actually a film script which was written by Ian Rankin, no less, a few years ago. And many of the most notary people in Scottish literary circles have tried to get this book onto film. There's been a couple of plays. There was a Scottish opera financed some years ago. But it would be the most marvellous. It would reduce most Gothic thrillers or horrors to footless whimsy. It is a book of absolute evil incarnate, deeply chilling, deeply frightening, and it would do great as a film itself. So James Hogg was celebrated in his day, not quite as celebrated as Burns, and he wasn't the gigantic figure that Burns was, but nonetheless celebrated and greatly admired from overcoming his humble origins. He went out of fashion, and now recently he's making a bit of a comeback. But just what a big figure he was in his time, and William Wordsworth wrote an obituary about him. The mighty minstrel breathes no longer, mid mouldering ruins low he lies, and death upon the braes of Yarrow has closed the shepherd poet's eyes. Wordsworth also said he was uncouth and had low manners, incidentally, but nonetheless, to get an epitaph written by William Wordsworth is no mean feat. But because he went out of fashion, and now has come back into fashion, and because he wrote one of the greatest books ever written by a Scot, I think the Ettrick Shepherd, James Hogg, is a worthy addition to our canon of Scotland's hidden heroes.
Welcome back. Now, Cate Blanchett brilliantly played conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly in the IMD series Mrs. America. The Eagle organisation is still very influential on the American right. Its president is Ed Martin, who now joins Alex.
Well, Ed Martin, president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, you're an influential right-wing group. Are all of your eggs in the Trump basket for 2024?
Well, you know, our organization, the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, as you said, it's an NGO. You know, the term is used more in Europe, NGO. In America, it's a nonprofit. So our work is on the issues. But our people, and myself included, are I can't say every person, but myself and Phyllis Schlafly's son, John Schlafly, who plays a senior role. We're both supporting Trump. And we've talked about that. But on the issues, and one of the reasons it's good to talk to you, Alex, about this, we try to speak to every campaign. I've talked to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign about some of his positions. I talked to all the Republicans for sure, because we have policy issues that we care about that are outside of the campaigns. But obviously, it's the biggest thing going on is the presidential race.
Now, of course, Ed Martin, before the last Trump presidential campaign, or his first one rather, you were the co-author of the Conservative Case for Trump with Phyllis Schlafly herself. Now, that was a very influential book because at that time Trump was regarded with a great deal of suspicion in many conservatives in America. I mean, has that suspicion entirely evaporated, or is he now the right wing's man in America, or are there still people who say, look, this guy is not really a right winger, he's just a charlatan?
Yeah, no, I would say the conservatives in America, you're calling us right wingers. I accept the term, but the conservatives in America are solidly with Trump. I think even when he did some things that the conservatives would look at critically, like some of the COVID steps, the Republicans, the conservatives, we forgive him. On life issues, for example, he appointed really good judges and justices. He has since said what he always said, which is he believes that there should be abortion for certain cases. And he's also said it's not a good thing to talk about. It's not going to be settled at the federal level. So, but we all, the conservatives, we know what the guy was like in office. As you referred to, in 2015 and 2016, when we wrote that book, people had to take Phyllis Schlafly and my word for it that he would be conservative. Now he has a record. And while not perfect, it certainly was more conservative as to American sovereignty, as to a conservative position, Alex, that I think you and I would share, which is the conservative position is no longer fight wars in all parts of the world. It's, keep America cleaned up, let other people do what they're doing. That's Donald Trump's position. We're not going to be, under Trump, fighting all these wars. There's a segment of the Republican Party and all the Democrat Party that wants to fight every war and build every nation. That's not what Trump does. So conservatives and parents and social conservatives are with Trump, yes.
Now, the President Trump is facing some 90 criminal charges in 2 states, 2 federal districts, and a rather dangerous-looking civil case in New York on his organisation. I mean, do you think he can successfully see off all of these charges and the civil case and emerge to battle out at the ballot box?
I mean, I have to say, I never bet against Trump. He's sort of this master survivor and succeeds. But let me take them in order, as you mentioned. And you were saying beforehand, what's the biggest alligator out there to get him? It's actually the case up in Washington, the January 6th related case that's in federal court in Washington that has real teeth in it and has. The prosecutor there has laid a groundwork in a way that is going to be very difficult to challenge. And so let me go back in order. The New York case is about business licenses. Even if he loses that, there may be a fine and his business may have to do business elsewhere.
Might be expensive, Ed.
Yeah, very expensive and very ugly, but that's not going to endanger him. The Mar-a-Lago documents case, notwithstanding all the leaks about it and all, that's not a real threat. I think that's something that nobody really understands. Joe Biden's case against him today or yesterday, they said it would not there'd be no charges. But the January 6th case in Washington, D.C., scheduled to begin in March, is about what happened in Washington. Now, as you know, Alex, I represent 3 of the defendants, regular people that were arrested after January 6th. I've worked on a lot of cases. I can tell you that I find it very unfair. I find the system breaking down, the American legal system, because of how it's been done. But having said all that, it's still federal court with federal prosecutors, and that's the most dangerous alligator out there that could really bite him. And now that back to your real question, can he survive all of this and be elected? He certainly is more popular than ever, and Joe Biden is less and less popular, but it's a very big challenge. And one of the challenges is the legal problem. The other is that a lot of regular voters, when you say somebody's been indicted on 90 charges, they think he did something, and it will be a drag on his campaign. So it's not a simple thing, even though he is surging right now in terms of popularity.
Now, if Trump is the giant, there's a range of Republican dwarfs who are having debates with each other at the present moment. Is there in any of these debates any one of the Republican challengers to President Trump are emerging as a serious threat, or are they all basically left in his shadow?
Yeah, I mean, the practical answer, and you alluded to 2015, I had just finished a term as a member of the Republican National Committee. And so I was involved in the primary process and in the debate process. And so I know it really well. And as a practical matter, none of the candidates in the primary have a chance to challenge Trump. It's just, that's the reality in terms of where the numbers are, where the spending is. I will mention 3 of them, because if Trump does not make it in terms of whatever, there are 3, I'd say, front runners. And one is Ron DeSantis from Florida, the governor, who has a sort of good record, if you like his policies, of getting things done. Nikki Haley, who served under Trump at the UN and has a international profile. She's really a neocon. She's a throwback to the days of George W. Bush and that crew. And I don't think she can win, but she's very persuasive. She's very popular. I think Americans, especially Republicans, like to see a fresh feminine face. She does a nice job. I'm not a fan of her policies. And then the wild card is this Vivek Ramaswamy, who has fit the slot that Trump is really dominating, but it's the slot of a smart guy, a talented guy who did lots of other stuff, doesn't really need this, and is going about it. And he's been a surprise. So I think those 3 have some staying power, but I don't see how one of them can get past Trump in the primary system. And Alex, I'll concede to you this: both the Democrat and the Republicans, they have a primary system that is stupid, and it's not real. It's driven by big money and big name ID, and it's a disaster for both parties, but it is what it is, and Trump is dominating that primary process for sure.
Now, you mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr. a few minutes ago. What is it about the range of his policies that might be attractive to some on the conservative wing of politics? Because many of his positions are what you would associate as being classic liberalism.
Yeah. As he's run a little bit more in the process, I think a lot of Republicans and conservatives have seen, as you say, he's more pro-choice, for abortion. He's more, as you say, classically liberal. But the 2 things that he has that are very attractive: one, we have a nostalgia in America for the Kennedys. I mean, they have a standing that's sort of Camelot and all. And 2, in multiple areas, RFK Jr. has said, they're lying to us on COVID. They're lying to us on the assassination of his uncle and his dad. And, the Oliver Stone has a documentary out about 18 months ago, I think it was, that when you watch it about JFK, about the assassination, the Warren Commission, and what you look up and you say is, when RFK Jr. says the intelligence community is deceiving us, the government is lying to us, so the NIH, it's a lot of people feel that. And he's someone who, again, doesn't need the job, doesn't need the money. So people kind of look at him and say, what's he saying? And I got to tell you, I'm sure you've seen it, but he's very charismatic. Guy's 70 years old. He's got all that Kennedy in him. And then he has things like, He's a recovering addict, and he's very eloquent about that. And a lot of Americans relate to that. And so he's a phenomenon. I don't think he has a path. Again, Alex, we could talk about this all day, because the system, Republican and Democrat, two-party system, is rigged. It's rigged by both parties. It's rigged by Washington and the media to not allow anything different. And so I don't see how he makes it, but I think he's making noise and making some waves.
Now, you alluded earlier to the argument that Donald Trump would make, that he is the only American president since 1908 not to start another war, or to participate in one. Let's be more judicious about it. But that new isolationism, attractive to many in the conservative side of American politics, that doesn't extend presumably to the state of Israel and the Middle East. There's still intervention to be supported there, I take it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Alex. I do think that you're seeing, if you've seen Tucker Carlson, who has a big voice in the current American scene, he's been more open and talking about, hey, what are we doing here in terms of Israel? And I think there's a lot of conservatives that do have some concern, again, not about Israel defending its sovereignty, but about what happens next and what's the vision next. And, I do find a lot of conservatives will say this, and I'll say it. Why are we sending Israel $18 billion? They can borrow money just like we can. I mean, we're printing or borrowing money from China to send to Israel. This is really stupid. So if that makes me anti-Israel, I don't think it does. But more people are saying that. And I think it's, Alex, I always enjoy talking to you, and I enjoy that you are fighting so hard to get the voices out. In America, we are still so dominated by the media and by big tech, and their vision is all one side. And in this case, it's pro-Israel, and it's hard to believe everything I see because I don't trust them. But Americans are there. Look, it's like Ukraine. And most Americans were, oh yeah, we got to stand up for Ukraine, because they were fed that message by the media. And when you looked into it closer, you said, wait a second, I'm not praising either side, but don't make one out to be holy and one out to be evil. These are neighbors fighting each other. So we have a problem that's worse and worse with the media and big tech and what they're doing to our understanding of the issues.
When you saw President Xi and President Biden the other day, what did that make? Was your reaction, well, that's good to see the two greatest powers on earth on speaking terms? Or did you say, wait a minute, China's going to steal our lunch? What was your reaction?
It's a little bit of both. I've been schooled, and I won't deny it. I've been schooled in the Trump teaching that in the world, it's not our job to judge everybody else. Kim Jong-un, what we needed was, he may be a thug and a weasel and a liar, I don't know, but we needed him to stop doing nuclear development, and he did with Trump, right? And when it comes to people say, oh, Saudi Arabia is this or that, and the way Trump did it was, if you can get these guys to behave in a way that helps keep stability, let's do it. So on one level, I say you got to talk to President Xi. You can't be at odds completely. He's a nuclear power. On another level, the problem is Joe Biden. I mean, it's so embarrassing to see him not have assertiveness, it doesn't feel like an equal relationship. And, it's embarrassing. We cleaned out San Francisco. San Francisco has a drug problem, a mental health problem, a homeless problem. We cleaned it out and whitewashed it to show President Xi. And, we hadn't done anything for those people before that, but it's done for him. And all the big corporations line up and pay a boatload of money to sit at the head table with President Xi, the Apple and everybody, because they want the markets. I think I'm glad we're talking to them. We don't want to fight every nuclear power. I don't want to judge everything in China, but I do think it's foolish to not have a stronger leadership when you have such a problem. And, fentanyl is kicking, Alex, is just destroying families and communities here. And it's coming through China, and we're doing nothing about it. TikTok is decimating our country, causing our kids to be lunatics. And that's owned by communist China. So I don't know. I feel like Biden does such a poor job of being strong that it takes away from what is probably a necessary diplomatic engagement.
Well, Ed Martin, there'll be a clip of this interview on TikTok, so hopefully that'll be an antidote to some of the other material. But hand on heart, Ed, when we're speaking in 14 months' time, and we'll speak before then, but when we're speaking in 14 months' time, will it be President Trump, President Biden, or President someone that we don't really think has a chance just now, but might emerge and surprise us all? What will it be?
As of today, Alex, the way things are feeling in America for voters and for citizens, I think Trump has a very clear path. As of today, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the economy is working and how things feel and people. So I would say it's President Trump as of today. But what you and I know, and you better than me, is tomorrow will bring something different. I will be surprised if Joe Biden makes it to the election because he's so frail. But I can tell you this. The people I know that work with him, he's not planning on quitting. He's not going to go out and say, oh, I'll be a statesman. He thinks they've told him for decades he can't win for president. You're a plagiarist. You can't even run. You called Obama names. You can't run. And he keeps landing on his feet. And his answer is, don't tell me I can't do it. I keep doing it. I'm president. So I think as of today, Alex, I would say it's Trump. But tomorrow, who knows what that will bring.
Ed Martin, thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Always a pleasure, Alex. Thank you.
Well, what a show that was. I doubt if there are two more eloquent advocates for diametrically opposed positions than Wade Davis and Ed Martin. In fact, the presidential debate I would like to see in the United States of America is between Wade Davis and Ed Martin. That would be a debate worth seeing. From Wade Davis' point of view, Donald J. Trump is evil incarnate. He's someone who's challenging the very structure of the democracy of the United States. Wade Davis is probably the leading voice of American liberalism. Ironic because he's Canadian, Canadian professor, Canadian born, but he represents the best of the American liberal tradition. And his writing and his analysis and his affection for his adopted country shine through. He articulates the menace, the danger, the recklessness, the illegality, presumably, and the sharp business practices for which President Trump is being accused, and the threat that poses to the integrity of the state. That phrase he came up with, he said, never has a presidential candidate run before on wanting to even the score with his enemies. It does bring into stark relief the dangers of President Donald J. Trump. And then there's Ed Martin, a man who co-authored a really important book which paved the way for the first successful Trump run at being president. Because at that time, many in the right of American politics regarded Donald Trump as somewhat of a closet liberal, a secular liberal was how he was widely regarded. And in fact, that, of course, was Donald Trump's position a decade or so ago. But nonetheless, he saw within Trump that he would move to the right, move to a constituency, and of course he was correct. And Trump in office, basically, not on every issue, followed the what Ed Martin would describe as the conservative tradition. What we would say is probably the right-wing tradition of American politics. But the argument that is a consistent one about a free economy, about America not trying to be the world's policeman, and also the suspicion about the state in America, the forces that seem to regard American interventionism and American military exploits as being very good for their own businesses, and what that means in terms of the deep state. That's a tradition in the American conservative tradition, which is an eloquent one as well. Whether the thoughts are best represented by the potential and almost certain lineup, I suppose, of Joe Biden, if his health carries him through to another term, and Donald Trump, if he can keep out of jail and be able to stand for election, but a likely lineup in a year's time is Trump against Biden. Whether that represents either of the traditions well, I doubt very much, which is why I say after watching this programme, let's have a write-in vote for Wade Davis versus Ed Martin to be the next president of these United States. And now to Tasmina, who's going to tell us about where we go with next week's show.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. Now join us next week when the show gets back to Scottish politics. But remember, you can watch us every Thursday at 9 p.m, online on YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, you name it, we will be there. Remember and tune in and give us your tweets, messages and emails in response to our shows and some ideas for future shows. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.